It's been said that there's nothing like the present. It's also been said that the past is gone, the future is yet to come, only the present resides. And even nothing chews up the present like the past. Well, there's one more. Nothing like the future to distract the present. So one of the jobs of the moderator is to choreograph the session. And I thought at the last moment I would choreograph this little bit of exercise. And in putting these papers together, I thought it would be good to break them into two distinct groups because they spoke to different things and they were speaking together. The second group, referring to on aesthetics, sustainability, and spirituality, spoken in the same breath. The first group, which I think will challenge your notion of what sacred space is about. It will just turn your head around. And these refer to the navel of the world. Inez and Antonio will be presenting those papers. Now, one of the things that's intriguing about them is one looks at an inward way and the other at an outward way. So that's almost like saying, excuse me, do you have an innie or an outie? Okay. We need that. I don't have a biography of our speakers. I think about something that the Dalai Lama speaks about, something called the 4 reliances. And the first reliance has to do not to rely on the person, but to rely on their word. So that means that just because a person is hot, it doesn't mean that what they say is valid. And regardless of where they've come from, what's important is right now what they're saying. So I will first present Inez, and then Antonio will follow, and then we'll have a 10-minute question for them, and then we'll follow with the next half. Okay, Inez.
Okay, I hope everyone is still a little awake after the little intermezzo Dennis put us up to. I think that will be okay. I want to take you in my presentation to an early Sunday morning in March, when a group of people, babies, toddlers, their parents and grandparents gather at a field in a park in a newly built suburban area in the Netherlands. The group listens to a man in a bright green coat who provides them with information about the tree they're about to plant. It's a typically Dutch lime tree, and it can get over 100 years old, and it's therefore very suitable to celebrate the birth of a child, or in some cases mourn a deceased child. The man in the green coat is a board member of the Friends of the Maxima Park Foundation. After a request from one of the residents in the area, this foundation, which coordinates the activities in the park, decided to create a so-called birth forest in the Maxima Park and facilitate 2 planting days a year. Now, on a Sunday morning in March and on a Sunday morning in usually October or November, the 2 seasons that are most suitable for planting trees, a growing group of people gathers in the park to ritually plant a tree to celebrate the life or mourn the death of a baby. Rituals like these play a central role in the research on the emergence of sacred space I conduct in a large, presently built Dutch suburb called Leidse Rijn. I would like to argue that this birth forest is a sacred place. Maybe not sacred for everyone, but certainly sacred for the participants, for the people who plant a tree to celebrate or remember. In order to analyze how such places, such as the birth forest, come into being, I focus on 3 different dimensions of place, based on Henri Lefebvre's theory on the production of space. We have the physical streams and context of the place, the social relations and the way in people perceive and use the space, and the symbolic and imaginary layer. But first, some background information. You might or might not know that the Netherlands is a city country. A majority of its inhabitants live and work in a city, and the bulk of the country is located in the sphere of influence of the city. No metropolis like we have here in the United States, but several medium-sized cities and a large number of small ones. Despite this, multidisciplinary studies of the city are rare. My field of research, the suburb of Leidse Rijn, is currently constructed as part of the city of Utrecht, which has 300,000 inhabitants and is one of the largest cities in the Netherlands. The new suburb is part of a proposal of the Dutch Ministry of Housing, Spatial Planning and the Environment, the Ministry of VROM, and it's a so-called VNEX plan. This plan, the term VNEX, stands for Vierde Nota Ruimtelijke Ordening Extra in Dutch, which is the 4th memorandum for spatial planning extra. The plans were drawn up in the early 90s of the last century, and they conducted the preferred outlines of the urbanization of the Netherlands in the period between 1995 and 2015. In this time period, the Dutch government desired to construct around 800,000 new houses. The aim of the VNEX plans was to build the majority of the houses within the outskirts of existing cities. The neighborhood of Leidse Rijn, as I said, is being constructed on the west side of the city of Utrecht. Utrecht is, well, this is the Netherlands, and Utrecht is located in the middle of the country. And I don't know if you can see it, but this is the city of Utrecht, and Leidse Rijn is a really big part on this, on the west side of the city. The new neighborhood incorporates 2 existing villages called Vleuten and de Meren, and their traditional infrastructure. And the plans state that once the neighborhood is finished, it will consist of approximately 30,000 new houses and between 80,000 and 100,000 urban dwellers, which is a large extension in a city the size of Utrecht. And whereas for centuries church buildings have functioned as the center of Dutch villages, cities and even neighborhoods, in the urban plans of Leidse Rijn, a church and any traditional religious buildings are left out of the equation. Instead of surrounding a church and accompanying churchyard, the 18 different sub-neighborhoods in the area are built around an enormous park, several historical heritage sites, a sculpture garden and a singing glass tower. On this picture you see the city of Utrecht, which is, this is the Dom church. And it's in the city of Utrecht still not allowed to build anything higher than the Dom church. So it still functions as the center of the old city. In this paper I attempt to show how the main elements of the neighborhood design, which are nature, history and heritage and art, function as stages for ritual practice, changing them, or at least parts of them, into sacred places for certain groups or individuals. Therefore, I interpret the term sacred in line with the American scholar Matthew Evans as set apart with special meaning. This more situationalist approach is inspired by the ideas of Emile Durkheim, which he explains in his book The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, which he published in 1912. In this work, Durkheim states that the sacred should not be taken to mean simply those personal beings we call gods or spirits, but a rock, a tree, a spring, a stone, a piece of wood, a house, in other words, anything at all, can be sacred. Those ordinary or sometimes not so ordinary objects become sacred as they are treated with special care and respect and preserved from profanation, making them set apart, and radically different from any other aspect of the mundane human life. Hence, Durkheim defines the sacred in a way in which his people experience it and the way they behave in relation to it. Evans elaborates on this theme of the set-apart sacred. As the ideas of Durkheim, Evans states that everything and anything can be sacred. The concept is not bound to a religion or the transcendent, nor is it determined by a set of rules or regulations. This paper will follow this broad interpretation of the sacred, thereby strongly emphasizing that the sacred is not the same as religion. In my opinion, every individual and every group can have its own opinions about sacrality, since, as with beauty, what is sacred lies in the eye of the beholder. The introduction shortly mentions that space is produced and that there are three dimensions constantly interacting on the move in this production process. Henri Lefebvre elaborated on this in his book The Production of Space, and his theory has been interpreted in various ways ever since. In my studies, I came across a Dutch interpretation of his theory in the book Nederland Stedenland, that can be translated as The Netherlands, a City Country. This book has been published in 2012 as the outcome of a large-scale research project on urbanism and the city. The chapters of the book are divided into three parts: the urbs, the civitas, and the topos, referring to three dimensions of an urban triad. The first aspect, the urbs, refers to the physical city, or the city of the urban planners and architects, and to knowledge on the spatial structure and the built shape of the city or neighborhood. The urbs have a strong public character and are influential. When it comes to urban planning, this aspect is specifically interesting since it provides the residents of the area with their daily living environment. An environment which includes certain elements but also excludes others. That way, the life of the Vinex residents is influenced since it plays an important role in determining their living environment. The second pillar is civitas. The city has a place in which political, economical, and social and cultural developments come together, and whereby space and place play an interesting and important role. It denotes the way in which people generate, use, and perceive space. It structures all aspects of daily life and urban living, from minute-repeated gestures to the rehearsed journeys from home to work or to play. It refers to a broad spectrum of human actions, varying from walking, gardening, recreating, but also, which is specifically interesting in my research, it can be ritual practice. It needs to be emphasized, though, that there is nothing intrinsically ritual or religious about those practices. Of course, people using the space are influenced by the way in which the area was planned, but they also have the power to create their own stories within the shape they have been offered, thereby creating stories which are inaccessible for planners and scientists. The planting of the birth trees is an example of such a practice. The last element of influence in the urban life is described by the term topos. The Greek word topos here refers to the rhetorical side of the city, to the way it functions in text, images, and representations. The topos functions separately from the two other dimensions, but at the same time it always encircles and overlays them. The term can be used to describe the ideals, the ideas, the dreams, and the visions of people, among which religion and other sacred perceptions should also be placed. Topos attempts to explain the way in which people understand space, the association and symbolic meaning they attach to it. It happens often that people describe a park making use of terms such as an oasis or a paradise. This does not mean that the park is actually a paradise, or that it was designed to be a paradise, but it's used to describe the way in which people experience the park. In short, it is possible to capture this triad as follows. The imaginations and artistic representations referred to by the term topos is, as it were, a symbolic layer which is spread out over the physical environment, the urbs, and the way in which we live and move around, the civitas. But how does this theory relate to the emergence of sacred space in this Vinex area? A newly built suburb is, in my opinion, the ideal place to see how places for the sacred emerge in line with the changing dynamics in this field and how these have their repercussions on the built environment and the life of people in this environment. As traditional religion and its accompanying places are disappearing from Dutch society, two church buildings are closing down in Holland every week, which makes about 100 a year, so there's something definitely changing there. The demand for the sacred, however, remains unchanged, shedding light on a broad and changing sacred panorama reaching beyond religion to the fields of memory, leisure and culture. The emergence of the sacred is all about the way in which people use a space offered to them by the urban planners, as their ritual practices overlay the physical environment with a symbolic layer, making this specific place set apart with a different meaning. For my research, in which I will focus on the emergence of sacred space in the newly built suburb of Leidse Rijn, I will present one of my case studies, the trees of birth, as an example to illustrate the prior explained theory. I don't only study the planting of the trees, but I also study the rituals that emerge after the planting of the trees. So I will elaborate on that a little further. Of course, the ritual planting of a tree is not a completely new phenomenon. In Judaism, you have specific holidays to celebrate the new year of the tree. And also, it's common in Indian religious traditions for the tree to play an important role. In addition to common religious traditions, nature in general, and maybe more specifically trees, are a returning theme in contemporary commemoration ceremonies, as we also saw in the presentation given on the memorials yesterday. A number of these modern-day commemoration rituals take place in a garden, a park, or a forest. I will now shortly give an impression of the park that I'm talking about, to give you a little idea. Part of the park, they have given nature free way, or how do you call that? Nature can do what it wants. The whole park is around 300 acres, so it's pretty big. We have some sheep that keep the grass cut, and there are a lot of activities for the residents of the area, and the Dutch like ice skating, so in the winter there's a lot of ice skating going on. Back to the planting of the trees. Most of the trees in the Leidse Rijn birth forest are planted to memorize a happy occasion, the birth of a child. There are few exceptions of trees that are planted for babies who died at or soon after childbirth. And although special planting days are organized, the planting of the trees in the birth forest should not be seen as a collective ritual. When the group arrives at the planting location, they immediately split up into their separate family groups, often consisting of at least 3 people, the parents, grandparents, sometimes a sibling, and the baby that is concerned. And they start looking for their own tree, which is marked with the name of the baby, you can see here. And each group plants its own tree. Although the trees are free, the people are free to shape the planting ritual any way they want, there are a lot of similarities. The photo camera is always present, and pictures are being taken of every step of the planting process. The name label hanging from the tree is photographed, and the hard labor of the planting of the tree and the final result. Everything is put on film. Of course, they try their best to have the baby present in all of the pictures, and if possible, the older children are actively involved in the planting process, and the parents sometimes even bring a little scoop or a sprinkling can so they can really participate. The group takes turns filling up the hole, and playful complaints are made about the hard work they have to do on this Sunday morning. When the hole is filled, some parents hang the birth announcement card from the branches. Sometimes the cards are carefully covered in plastic to make sure they will last longer. They use the card to mark and identify the tree. A third action recently gaining more popularity is the reading of a poem or a wish for the newborn baby after the planting of the trees. Observing various planting days, I came to know that the most important aspect of this ritual for the participants is the location, the place of the tree. Most participants deliberately make the decision to plant a tree in their new neighborhood as they want to build a future there for their family. Moreover, after the planting ceremony, everyone receives a certificate with the exact GPS location of the tree to make sure that they are always able to find it again. In addition, some people tie a knot in one of the still flexible branches of the tree. When the participants return to the tree, they like to see if the tree is healthy and growing well, or to water it in a dry summer. When the children are older, they will be big enough they can carve a heart into their own tree with the one they love, one of the parents says. Other participants return to the tree on specific moments. A lady who planted a tree for her daughter who died at childbirth returns every year on the birthday of the little girl. We eat cupcakes on a bench nearby and hang little ribbons from the branches of the tree, she says. The tree planting ceremony shows how the park, which holds a central position in the neighborhood design, functions as a stage for ritual practice. The plans of the designers made for the park are focused on the long term. Only in years or maybe even decades it will grow out to look the way the planners intended it to look. Therefore, in addition to it being a personal ritual to celebrate the life or mourn the death of a child, the tree planting ceremony is also meant to create a connection between the dwellers and their new living environment. The participants are, as it were, included in the growth process of the park. Together with their personal tree, the park will grow out to be a special place connected to the life of their children. The residents of the area are using the park to ritually plant trees, changing the park, or at least part of the park, into a sacred place. A place which is set apart because it has a special meaning and reminds them of their newborn or deceased child. This process shows the working of the urban triad, as it shows the correlation between the herbs, hereby referring to the physical aspects of the neighborhood, the civitas, as the residents choose to make use of this design in a certain way, to use the park as a place for ritual practice, and by these practices overlaying the place with their imaginations, attributing a special meaning to it, the topos. By planting a tree on the specific location, this place has come to influence the senses, the memory and the future practices of the visitors. Now a symbolic layer is overlaying the physical environment, making this birth forest set apart with a special meaning.
I won't say it again. That was the innie. Here's the outie. Antonio.
Wow, an Audi.
Did you say Audi or Howdy?
I would say rather Fiat or something like Fiat 500. I would like to thank Nadia and Tom and everyone else involved in organizing this really wonderful event. So the last 2 days have just been really, really wonderful, and I had, enjoyed so many nice presentations, met so many nice people. So I'm trying to kind of like charm you before my presentation. Maybe not so hard on me, but I'm going to talk about something that I refer to as new sacred geographies. I kind of made that term up because I kind of felt what I'm trying to accomplish here is something architectural, but on a much, much, much broader scale. So, characterized by the cultural sensibilities and social visions that formed the mass consciousness of the modern world, the 60s were synonymous with the expansion of existing realities in almost every aspect of human life. Everything is music, all is love, Allen Ginsberg's Everything is Holy, or Joseph Beuys' Everything is Art, expressed optimism and dynamism and dynamics in a time of cultural crisis. In his manifesto, Absolute Architecture, Austrian architect Hans Hollein criticized architecture, quote, as a ritualistic expression of pure elemental will and sublime purposelessness. In times of conformism and post-industrial crisis, he questioned if architecture had the capacity to extend the means of its own determination beyond built statements. In his proposal, Everything is Architecture, he eliminated any closures of defining architecture and removed all boundaries between architecture and other fields. He argued that the truth of everything is architecture and the process of redefinition and emergence of a new self-determinate. For thousands, so this is a little break here now, for thousands of years, the transformation of man's world with buildings as the essential manifestation of man contributed to an inapplicable sense of gravitas. Especially, sacred structures have been manifested in iconic sculptural objects as an expression of the consistent human desire to translate these forces into recognizable monuments. In the aftermath of World War II, mass consumerism characterized the American society and influenced the political economy and national identity of Americans, determining how they made a living, where they dwelled, and what they consumed. In the past, values took their character from the church. Post-war identity, however, was formed by business and consumption, defining a new sense of value, values, and tradition. These cultural changes continued to influence religious architecture that shifted its focus from iconic early 20th century churches for mass evangelism to more recognizable structures that blended with the post-war commercial landscape. In this paper, I aim to examine how evangelist Robert Schuller challenged the public perception of Protestantism in the United States, and with the ambition to define new horizons in evangelism, he developed formal repertoires that looked beyond institutional frameworks and embraced the world as a possible scale of operation. In times of decentralized culture and deregulated religious ecologies, Schuller's vision was to embellish architecture in mass media and mass consumerism. His philosophy of retailing religion served as his guiding principle and merged mass consumerism and religion with the ambition to expand the perception of his church. In the 19th century, revivalist preachers like George Whitefield went out of institutional frameworks to preach the word where it was needed. When people wouldn't come to church, then the church would have to come to people. Schuller, however, blurred these boundaries with his church. His understanding of sacred space was suggested if religion could be retailing, it potentially could be everywhere and everything without being bound to institutional frameworks. While some critics insist that the commercial aesthetic of post-war churches are sites of disappearance and of meaning, his sense for translating the cultural geography into sacred spaces suggested that the boundless revitalization of his church gained public presence through the disappearance of meaning and representation. His idea of expanding the religious image not only overcame traditional meanings of sacred architecture, but also the traditional dichotomy of form and function, suspending it as a critical instrument between autonomy and total immersion. Inspired by the 19th century revivalism and modern visions that were obsessed with mobility and its culture, Robert Schuller imagined a sacred space without compromising the moral objectives of revivalism. Unlike the 18th and 19th century revivalists who relied for spiritual renewal and change of mindset upon the defamiliarization of the emerging urban population in the wilderness, Schuller wanted to familiarize the seeker using the car, television, and other modern commodities and bring them into a religious context as part of an immersive evangelical experience. Where others held on to traditional Main Street church models, he found purpose in the ramifications of rapid urbanization and all other societal conditions that came with the cultural shifts after the war. Though he advocated valuing the divine order over the existing capitalist order, he did not reject commercial aesthetics that came with it. Actually, he employed the rapidly growing mobile society and fused it as an integrated extension of his church and a new sacred order. His endeavor began in 1955 when he arrived in Southern California. He came from Illinois, where he, in only 5 years, grew a church from 35 members into a congregation over 500. With this success, but no money in his pockets, Schuler moved to Orange County, where he saw the opportunity to establish a new Reformed church. He coincidentally found a drive-in movie theater vacant on Sunday mornings that served his purposes of Reformation. That's the theater. He rented the place and preached rain or shine from the concession stands of the theater. He delivered his message via the standard drive-in theater radio transmission that was attached to the cars. His drive-in service was so popular that he gained enough funds to build an actual church. However, the Sunday morning service at the drive-in theater became such an essential part of his practice that after an opening of his chapel, he continued preaching in both. In 1959, Schuler had the idea to merge the two and make his dream of a drive-in walk-in church reality. In search of an architect that could build his vision, he found Richard Neutra, who perhaps was the only architect in California equal to his ambitions. He certainly was the most famous practitioner at the time and skilled enough to develop Schuler's complex vision. Neutra took on what seemed to be an impossible challenge. Despite the imminent contradictions between the modest traditions of Christianity and the image of a humble preacher that merged with that of a heroic movie star, the opening of the Garden Grove experiment in 1961 gave the Christian world a glimpse into the future of what was possible in modern circuit architecture. Transparent glass facades, vivid gardens with water features, and a car amphitheater were only the beginning of a new era. A few years later, in 1968, with the completion of the Tower of Hope, Neutra completed Schuler's important vertical symbol in the otherwise horizontal landscape of Orange County. The 90 feet tall structure with high-speed elevators and the first 24-hour telephone counseling center in America further emphasized his vision of new horizons in evangelizing the Southern Californian landscape. This is just like a little fun fact. Those were the tallest structures in Southern California, and one was the fake Matterhorn at Disneyland. Kind of ironic. His church in a tower, tallest structure in the region, transmitted a new image of Christ to the public and provided a visual pivot point that was characterized by a new sense of an intensified sensory perception of an expanded religious experience. Despite the modern interpretations of evangelical revivalism, Schuler understood that the ideological separation of urban and pastoral values created a breeding ground for new religious ideologies. In order to sustain the success of his church, he needed to position it right between the grounds on which political and religious campaigns battle for the attention of American families. The American home, a place where a man could display his success through the accumulation of new consumer goods, became the place in which morality and domesticity conflicted with secular lifestyles. Citizens who felt suffocated by the dream of the American paradise, lonely in their idealized homes or office cubicles, began to search for a new sense of purpose, which churches promised to provide. In spite of the ambition to move beyond ideology, Schuler nourished pastoral values, but fused them with culture and entertainment into something that could be characterized as the cult of the new, an irrational belief that new is always better. This cult, probably the most radical aspect of the post-war era, for better or worse, was in constant need to produce more and more new products and events. Schuler perfected his strategy and provided new consumer-oriented services with architecture as a framework that fully absorbed material culture with religion as a product. Moreover, he employed the American dream as a metaphor and placed the constantly self-renewing dream symbolically somewhere between the other and reality, a place between pastoral and urban values representing a symbolic location that developed a direct or inverse analogy to real space of society. The reciprocity of the economic and symbolical political systems in the 1960s challenged evangelical churches to act within all types of frameworks, large and small, traditional or progressive. The growth of evangelical Christianity represented a rejection of liberal, secular pragmatism and contributed to a revival that countered the materialism of consumerism with a search for authenticity and meaning. I could slow it down, I think I'm good in time. The emergent evangelical middle class struggled with a dichotomy between values and value systems in newly built suburban environments that otherwise were characterized by a lack of organically grown communities. In such environments, the shopping mall became a place that satisfied the need, what Liz Cohen refers to as citizen consumer. Shopping malls moved into the center of community life and became the nexus of public life that seamlessly integrated the spirits of post-war America. Robert Schuller saw the need to address these changing societal conditions and challenged the public perception of religious institutions to change direction and address the decentralized culture and subsequently a deregulated religious ecology. Fearing that the church would further detach itself from the world and become culturally marginalized and institutionally fragmented, Schuller envisioned a prosperously growing institution that was vital and big across the United States. He claimed that the traditionalist leaders were tragically missing the connection of successfully early 20th century church growth. He even argued, and I quote, "Much as it may offend many leaders in the church, in the Christian church, the truth remains that the parish church is in the business of retailing religion." End of quote. He seized upon the idea of retailing as a new motive for an expanded religious service and an architecture that would package goods and service for the consumer. By emphasizing physical characteristics such as accessibility and location, Schuller recognized the fact that churches, like businesses, needed easy access and a flow of people. His analysis of traditional churches and Main Street churches found that these models violated the fundamental principle of successful retailing. In his pamphlet, "Your Church Has Real Possibilities," he explained that one of the major criteria of a successful church is surplus parking, as we can see. With the development of shopping centers, Americans had become used to the convenience of easy parking. But a look at reality gave evidence that parking wasn't always easy for churchgoers at super churches. In his church, parking was staged and a very important part of his religious practice and the larger architectural ensemble. Parking became such an integral part of his philosophy that it became an extension of his church and his practice. "Time is," and I quote him again, "time is too valuable to waste making a trip only to find they don't have the goods. Consumers will go where the business has the reputation for having a wide inventory range and parking." His understanding of the quotidian translated into his service and architecture, in which the divine became an integrated extension of the real world. In a conversation with Schuller, Neutra asked, "Why did the churches ever get into the custom of building structures that obstruct from their view of the outside secular world?" End of quote. Schuller supposed it would come from the concept that God is in the sanctuary or in and around the altar. Neutra felt enlightened by Schuller's response, but Christians sought fellowship with Jesus on the mountaintop, in the outdoors. They had experiences with Christ under the open sky and in the sanctuary and on the beach. Neutra then proceeded to answer his own question. In the early days, the Christians were forced underground, and in the dark underground caverns, candles were required to give light. Consequently, little children were raised to have religious experiences in a setting where the world was shut out and only candles flickered. So when the Christian children became adults and finally emerged in the sunlight, they designed the structures that would recreate what is in their minds and a sort of a religious mood. Hundreds of thousands of churches are designed to stimulate not the positive emotions of joy and hope that come with the fall of the sunlight in the room. Rather, they are designed to stimulate the negative emotions of darkness, dreariness, and gloom. Schuller felt painfully sorry for pastors who tried to impress modern Americans with churches based on traditional models. He claimed, churches like this, quote, churches like this announce to one and all, this church is old-fashioned, out of date, and from past generations without any exciting plans for the future. Schuller believed that the evolution of the soul belonged to a larger whole and was more significant and beautiful when integrated with the secular world. I think that's very important. With this vision of the church, she imagined places in which the secular and the sacred could coincide in a new religious experience. His architect's proposal offered a therapeutic resolution for what Sylvia Levin described as a pathological psychology of ecclesiastic, I knew that, I cannot say that word, architecture, yes, thank you. Although originally motivated by economic need and convenience, his story and the coincidence that merged a church and a drive-in theater ended up transforming the traditional nature of evangelical churches, if not all. The increasing popularity of this new form of religious service was part of a strategy to establish characteristic images for his church that were properly suited to the urban landscape and a modern imagination. His idea created superb, as he calls it, architecture not only sought to change the church's imaginative and visionary image, but also attempted to evoke honesty through a universal architectural expression that, so Schuller says, hopefully becomes inconspicuous and nature becomes the center of attention. And so one is impressed with the sky, the water, the flowers, the trees, and the green grass, all of it, which means the structure becomes the vehicle for effective communication. When the large glass sliding doors of his church opened during the Sunday service, so basically the facade here opened up so that he could kind of preach to the outside and the inside at the same time. The act of stepping outside transformed the service into an event in which the automobile became an active participant in a religious service inside of the church.
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Oh, wow. Let me jump to a couple of conclusions then. Maybe just go through a couple of slides. This is just a sketch from Richard Neutra, how he imagined worshippers in the car. This is an analogy between Schuller and a revivalist preacher in the 19th century, where I feel like reaching out to the sky, kind of like blurring the horizon, kind of making the horizon more accessible to everyone. We can see that in revivalism. Kind of dorky today, actually. So in conclusion, sacred architecture has undergone various significant transformations in the past century. For some, the 20th century brought about the triumph of secularization over many aspects of material culture, and for others, the secular, rational, and politicized contributed to a new misunderstanding of sacred architecture. The resurgence of the questioning of the religious at a global scale is crucial in that it provides the backdrop to uncovering the critical importance of religious thought on urban and architectural theory that existed despite the secularization impulse of modernity. The common understanding of modern sacred architecture was defined by its metaphysical value, which in false conclusion was determined by the strict adherence to achieve a mystical and poetic dimension. The reciprocity of the mystical and the poetic, economic, commercial, and political systems challenged churches to act within all types of frameworks. After the war, the emergent evangelical middle class asserted their sense of values and tradition in newly built suburban environments. Within these environments, Schuller's architecture provided a framework for reclaiming the sacred that appeared to be lost to traditional models.
20 words. 20 words.
20 words left? I have to choose. I don't have to say which 20 words I'm going to use. The last 20. The infinite production of new images and means of representation that reflected changing cultural paradigms endangered 21 new processes of redefinition and emergence of the new self and a medium of expression expanded the field. Schuller's vision of spatial mobility generated a new topological diffusion which multiplied connections across the larger cultural landscape.
Hey.
I was just like grinding through it. Okay.
We'll have some questions. Sit on the
Hot seat.
hot seat. If we don't have enough questions, then you could fill in the rest of your paper there. Will depend on the compassion of the questioners. Where we have a question.
No, it's a local question. Thank you very much. Both of those presentations were extremely interesting. This one is directed to Antonio. And I'll just say, this is really great because in 1971 and 1972, I sang with my college choir in the Garden Grove Community Church. And so I have this interior experience of having done that. It's really remarkable. So here's my question. With respect to issues of well-being, human well-being, and the relationship of community to human well-being, and the issues of environmental concerns and human well-being. And given that, I know that there were lots of interesting things that took place in that church. So I know that, for example, there were small communities within the church that met, in groups of a dozen or 2 dozen or something like that. So it was really serious ministry that took place in that church. But nevertheless, with respect to issues of community and with respect to issues of environment, would you characterize this on a spectrum of better to worse? And let me rephrase that. Let me rephrase it in a different way, which is to ask, is it a sustainable model? And if it's not a sustainable model, then would it be on the worse side instead of the better side?
I'm not sure if I'm in a position to make those kind of value judgments. I think this is just one little piece out of the history of those kind of churches, and I think it, in a very intelligent way, I think he used what was there. And in terms of sustainability, obviously that kind of model wasn't sustainable because the church fell apart, and now it changed owners many times. But other models kind of grew out of it. The mega church as a model, or internet churches and all these kind of things. So I think, like, as a general question, this notion of sustainability in the context of what we're trying to do here is an interesting question to ask. I think at this particular time and space, and as a result of revivalism and mass evangelism and like all those things that happened before, even 17th century Puritans kind of developing this idea of the meeting house on the East Coast, I think it was a sustainable model. Yeah.
Ramona?
This is for Inez. The birth trees seem like, the marking of birth and death are very fundamental focus points for any kind of sacred practice. And I'm wondering if you have seen any different iterations of ritual practice in the park. That is, does it move beyond the recognition of birth or death? Are there other things that are acknowledged there, or other ways that the community engages in some kind of ritualized practice?
Yeah, in the park there are numerous different sites. I chose the birth forest because it's one of the case studies that I already completed, but there's also, for example, an artwork which is called Ritual Deposition, in which the artist asked people from the neighborhood to contribute, how do you call that, things from their things that from their life that connects to the neighborhood. For example, there are people who've lived there for a long time, who are still part of the gardeners community that used to live there, and they contributed the weights the gardeners used to use. And other people contributed other elements from their daily life, and those were all casted in bronze and entrusted to the ground in special viewing cases. And the ritual burial of those objects, they attempted to create a connection with the history of the area and the new people living there, and in that way trying to establish some kind of identity or meaning. So there are various, also outside the park in the neighborhood, various other types of rituals emerging besides life and death. So yeah.
Question for you. Maybe it's sort of a comment, I'm not really sure. I lived in Utrecht for a year, and I'm quite familiar with the Dutch culture. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is the parallel between the parks, say, in these new Phoenix areas, and then the old idea of the green fingers. Nationally, the idea of this green center, the green heart, in the Netherlands. So this idea of the sacred, the nature having such a sacred space, even in the urban or level of regional, national planning, parallels, I think, to the local area. Maybe you have a comment on that.
Well, yeah, the problem or the thing about the Netherlands is that there is no true nature anymore. Like you know it here in the United States or in other big countries. All the nature in the Netherlands is planned, and we're very. For example, the Green Heart, which is a big nature area in between the big cities of the Netherlands, the biggest cities. We are very eager to protect that nature and to keep it into the Dutch total overall planning. So, yeah, nature plays an increasingly important role in the planning process in the Netherlands. That's true. Yeah.
Obviously, both of these open new doors for a lot of conversation. I guess I'll just try to point a couple of items. You have continued to relate to this phenomena of this birth forest still with using the word sacred space and sacred place. So, therefore, is this an aspect of pantheism that is occurring here? That is, while you say that there is no church and there is no churches being built, is this therefore finding the sacred within the material world? And I wonder if therefore, is this contradictory to your original intent of this place, that maybe the word sacred should not be used, is my question. It sounds to me like a contradiction.
Well, I think that, as I also said in my, my presentation, I think the sacred is something which every person or every group can decide for itself. And I see that in a neighborhood like this, in which everything is new and there's no real identity, or people are really seeking for something with meaning, something special. And I would define the sacred as something which is a place that is set apart from the normal and daily life with a special meaning, and that can take any form. It can take the form of a church building, of course, for those who relate to that, but it can also take the form of a bird forest or an artwork or a museum or going to a concert, or I think it's very broad in that sense. And
well, but you also used the introductory words that there is not a need for the element of the transcendent in this. Did you not? So therefore, is this possible that you could have a sacred place without a transcendent sense in it? And I'm not talking about God or any of these. I'm just using the symbolism of the transcendent. That is something beyond. Therefore, would this only then be a material horizontal place without a vertical axis, is what I'm asking.
I think, I don't know if I would call it transcendent, but it's, I mean, there's some people naming the soccer canteen as a place with special meaning for them, because they go there every Sunday and they meet their friends there and they have drinks there. So I think there is something that lifts it up from the daily life, but I wouldn't name that as something transcendent. But yeah, I think it's a matter of the way you would define it. Yeah.
We'll have to go to the next two. That was great. Thank you. So the next two papers, Justin Kelly? Is Kelly?
No, it's just me.
Just you.
Yeah.
There is no just you. We're going to look at aesthetics, sustainability, and spirituality spoken in the same breath. And Justin will start us.
Is that? I don't know how this.
I don't know either. He's the guy.
Okay. Kind of the guy. AV guy. Okay, so let's escape that. I'd like to escape. Okay, where are you? Okay, let me get behind the camera and then you can start.
Okay. What's...
There you go.
Oh, I see. We good? Okay. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm kind of in a turmoil at the moment. I'm very excited to be here, but my body is going into shutdown because of jet lag. So if I accidentally just fall over asleep, it's quite embarrassing. It's my own presentation. But yes, I'm Justin. I'm from Melbourne, Deakin University. I'm a lecturer there. This is part of a project that I did under the supervision of Kelly Miller. She's a senior lecturer at the School of Life and Environmental Sciences. I'm currently at the School of Health and Social Development. Oh, sorry.
Into the mic.
Okay. Is that good? All good? All right, just briefly, the research question that we posed was how do followers of the faith-based tradition perceive and act upon various environmental concerns? And so the aim then was to investigate the levels of awareness and involvement of the faith community on issues relating to environmental sustainability. So just as an overview of what I'll discuss today, I'll highlight some background areas of the research, some of the research projects and its design, and finally explore some of those findings. So just on the Australian front, the background on that, just the level of inquiry really has only begun since the late 1990s. We now have a few recent PhD graduates who've explored various faith communities. As you can see, most of the focus has really been on the Christian communities. There's only really been a shift in the last few years to a multi-faith background. This is in part due to the changing matrix of faith groups in Australia over the past several decades, where traditional Christian groups, such as the Protestant and Catholic communities, are gradually declining, while other faiths are increasing, namely Buddhism, Islam and Hinduism. That's mainly due to immigration, as opposed to conversions. So with this shift in the religious landscape of Australia, there are now other influences at play, and one that is making some presence is the inclusion of an environmental agenda. Now we've seen an engagement here in the US and Europe of faith and environmental issues for some time. However, in Australia, this is only a recent occurrence. I won't go into too many details about each of these organisations, but we'll highlight that the big three down here, they refer to the Catholic, Anglican and Uniting Church in Australia. They are the three main Christian traditions in Australia, and they do have their own environmental committees within those organisations. So it was with this in mind that an inquiry at a local, state and national level was undertaken to gauge the level of responsiveness and engagement within the religious community on a range of issues pertaining to sustainability. So the scope then of the study was Australia-wide. We looked at 6 major faith groups in Australia. Now, there is some contention about these groupings, but the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which is the national government agency for acquiring and processing census data, decided that these were the best to work with. So the study that we had consisted of 40 faith groups within those broader categories. So they included Buddhism, which is group 1. They basically just did it alphabetical. So we had Buddhism, Christian, Hindu, Islam, Judaism, and the other groups, group 6, we included the Baha'i, Taoists, pagans, spiritualists, Sikhs, and miscellaneous religions. We did want to include the smaller ones, say Indigenous, Jains, Zoroastrians and Confucianists, but they really don't number that many in Australia. I mean, collectively there's less than 10,000 adherents. So then the theoretical framework was based on a combination of grounded theory and full conceptual description. This addressed 5 themes of sustainability and 5 methods of implementation, which were selected due to importance and ease of management. Now, I won't go into too much detail about those. Suffice to say that we looked at biodiversity protection, energy efficiency, water conservation, waste management, and cultural property heritage. And so regarding the implementation strategies, we investigated education. So how were the faith groups informed? How effective was education on sustainability? We looked at advocacy and in what capacity do faiths advocate support in environmental issues, politically or corporately or locally. Facilitating action, so how do faiths engage in actions? We looked at networking, so what networks exist and where are those gaps? And then lastly, we looked at engaged ethics, so are there any effective campaigns derived from an environmental ethic? So those are just some of the questions that we posed to the various faith communities. Now we used a mixed methods approach that was employed for the study, and for mixed methods there's a range of techniques that can be employed. So for this study, we decided upon data, methodological and sampling triangulations. And data were obtained from different representatives of the community through surveys and interviews. Site visits were also undertaken in order to provide contrast and corroboration to information gathered through the surveys and interviews. And just to give you a quick snapshot of the scale of the national survey, we delivered almost 4,000 surveys across the country. So roughly just under 1,000 went to the public and just under 3,000 to members of faith communities around Australia. So then just focusing on site observations, that also was consisting of mixed methods. And in some instances, a passive observation approach was maintained, while in others, active participation in daily activities at particular sites were also undertaken, therefore taking on a ethnographic approach. So 35 sites were selected based on information provided by Huslucker. She wrote a book on spiritual retreats in Australia back in 2000, just like a guidebook. Willing workers on organic farms had their own directories. Numerous websites and recommendations from colleagues and friends. Tasmania and Northern Territory were not included due to accessibility and limited examples. And the fieldwork occurred intermittently during mid-2009 through to 2011 for the sites in Queensland, that's up here, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, way over here in Perth, WA. Not all the sites were staffed, so some of the locations were self-guided, lasting less than an hour, while at others it was possible to stay for several days at a time, sometimes working at the site with the residents and partaking in their specific rituals. Most of the visits were singular time events, and on one occasion, however, a return visit was made due to the initial visit being a formal and rushed event. So, getting to some of these results then. The range of responses to environmental issues from the faith community was very broad, and not one tradition could be singled out as having a comprehensive program of action. Certainly within each tradition there were standout communities from which to draw inspiration. The sites of worship used by the various faith community members reflected aspects of the themes that emerged from the interviews, and the most important of these which were, say, exemplar, so that living an example of environmental sustainable behaviour was viewed as the best form of education. Fragmentation, that unfortunately in advocating certain positions on environmental sustainability, there was not a collective response within a faith group. Doing, so that in facilitating action, individuals within faith groups were prepared to get involved in projects supporting environmental sustainable behaviour. Local community engagement, that rated very highly in networking to achieve environmental sustainability objectives. And then lastly, there was just no plan. So despite the intentions of support, there were difficulties in implementation, and hence very few environmentally sustainable projects or campaigns were planned. And there was one other major theme that emerged, was the awareness of creating a sacred link with the natural environment. Now, whilst the Indigenous term Nura was not used by any of the study participants, there were, after all, no Indigenous participants identified in the study. In Australia, it is probably the best term that best describes the concept of belonging to the land and community that many participants were grappling with. I mean, it is difficult since there are what we call cultural filters that inhibit us from fully embracing nature. There's a number of scholars who have acknowledged this, where a predominantly European background has restricted a view to a landscape such as that of Australia. It has been said that whites have no dreaming, and yet with re-enchantment, this process is involving increasing sensory awareness, reflection and creativity in situ, there is the possibility that a sacred link can be forged. Thus, there is immense value to be found in exploring the full range and nuances of this particular theme. Now moving to one of the examples of this re-enchantment. This can be found in New South Wales, Taona, so just up from Sydney, a couple hundred kilometres. It's a beautiful location. This is a lake here, Wallace Lake. This is a national park. There's a Pacific Ocean here. So just this narrow strip of land. It's a beautiful spot. This is called the Green Cathedral. And this is so called because basically it consists entirely of native cabbage palms, Livistona australis, with pews constructed from the same timber. Now it's interesting that as a constructed site, it is more akin to a pagan site, being in a grove of trees, as well as being reminiscent of one of the conversions held by Christ's disciple Paul, where people had gathered by the banks of the river to pray. That's in Acts 16:13. Also at the entrance of the cathedral is a dedication carved on a wooden panel from a poem entitled A Forest Hymn, which is written by William Cullen Bryant in 1824. This has a significant presence as the connections of the sacredness of nature to personal behaviour are explicitly made. Now that a church like this should be built in 1940 is quite remarkable. This is a very progressive development within a mainstream tradition based on an ancient act of worshipping in a forest. Furthermore, the example here demonstrates a sensitivity which would do well to be replicated in an urban setting. This, however, has been problematic, as land set aside for such practice in an urban environment is rare to find. In Adelaide, South Australia, a breakaway group from a Uniting Church in Australia denomination began holding services in the botanical gardens as a means of finding connection with God and nature within an urban environment, and consequently demonstrating one of the study's themes of fragmentation in the wider study. And it is by no means a fixed spot within that location. So in effect, a spectrum can be established within the Green Cathedral being on one end of a, say, scale of sustainability, where minimal environmental impacts can be demonstrated, Certainly it is rural and features entirely native vegetation with a minimal amount of electricity being used for lighting and amplification. At the other end of the spectrum is a type of structure that is in a highly urbanised location with considerable energy requirements and virtually no vegetation. An example of this can be found in practically any city and can be any faith group. So for example, here we have the Melbourne Buddhist Centre. This is in the central business district of Melbourne. They've actually now moved from there. There's about another 5 kilometres north of the city, but still pretty much in the city. Now, most of the sites of worship fall between these types, and consequently it is primarily a case of doing the most with what one has got. And this is determined in part by the very nature of the structure as to whether it is purpose-built or is revamped or a re-sacralised space. So for example, as a purpose-built sacred space, the Greek Orthodox Cathedral in Perth, over here in Western Australia, shows little opportunity for a retrofit. As can be the case here with the Cypriot Turkish mosque here in Sunshine, Victoria. That's about less than 15 kilometres west of Melbourne. Although you could say that the mosque has more available land and the opportunity to use solar panels on the lawns could be used. Now this Hindu temple in Helensburgh, New South Wales, that's about 50 kilometres south of Sydney. Sorry, I'm talking kilometres, I hope you can convert that to miles. Is also difficult to retrofit. Native gardens have been established and has a similar appeal and ambience to the Baha'i Centre here, also in New South Wales. Sorry. That's just north of Sydney. Now the Uniting Church in Australia, they have numerous churches, and one is in Caloundra in Queensland, about 90 kilometres north of Brisbane. That's this one over here. Now they're able to support solar power. It's one of the first ones installed in Australia, made some news, and that has now been replicated in other churches in the southern states. Now I haven't seen any other traditions beginning to do this, and I think it's interesting to see that the Christian communities who have decided to configure their panels in a very potent symbol. Obviously here, and you can just make out that one there. Now the other option for those in the faith community is to reclaim a site and make it sacred, so a form of resacralisation of formerly public or private property. Thus the community needs to work creatively with what has been acquired, and there are numerous opportunities for the site to be considerably improved. For example, a Sikh temple in suburban Melbourne was a former Australia Post delivery centre. That's it, just here. So it's quite a large complex, massive car park in the back. Now that has a very large floor space to accommodate a congregation of several hundred people. Industrial kitchen has been fitted within the site to produce meals that are freely given, and the building also houses a library and offices to support outreach programs. This contrasts greatly to the Sikh Communities Temple in Glen Osmond, South Australia, which is about 5 kilometres east of the central business district. Now, this used to be a former colonial hotel built in 1852. Now, improvements to the site are considerably restricted due to heritage bylaws. There is obvious advantage here that the Victorian Sikh community has over its South Australian counterparts with the historical significance of its site of worship, where the capacity to improve and retrofit the Victorian site is considerably more feasible. I mean, you can see panels being put up here, but here they are restricted with what they can use. So the concept then of enhancing the site of worship is by no means an isolated occurrence. There are other examples, however, these were only beginning to come to fruition when this study was finishing, indicating that the field is growing at a pace that is rather ad hoc. So we are beginning to see some intersecting lines of interests, which had not really occurred previously and have the potential to reap significant benefits. Now, regarding the Green Cathedral, there is the immediate contact with nature, which has gradually become an important feature in rehabilitation and education programs. This, however, is limited to very rural locations, as other open-air churches exist in Australia, and none is in heavily populated regions. Regarding those sites of worship which are in densely populated centres, there are other limitations to consider. However, the respite from the hectic world around them offers its own set of health benefits. It is then those that are located within less densely populated regions that offer the greatest range of benefits, with the opportunities to improve sites, provide enhanced outreach programs and offer a different space to contemplate and celebrate. So conclusions then. The path to environmental sustainability is still not clear. Actions that can possibly work for one faith community will not work for another. Simply it is a case of one size does not fit all. Two significant factors can be highlighted in order to explain why this is the case. One, the greening of a site of worship is inherently possible depending on the scale of operations. And two, there are some fundamental roadblocks to implementation due to cultural, architectural and regulatory aspects of particular sites of worship. Negotiating strategies around these roadblocks will take some exceptional vision and skill, which in many cases is not present. What this effectively means is that there is a need to look beyond the organisational structure and administration of the faith groups to find possible solutions amongst the wider community. So a culture of sustainability is beginning to foment within certain groups. However, this is checked by the lack of formal training and education in disciplines such as eco-theology. Changes are happening, but the responses are slow, and there is a need for further encouragement from outside parties with similar vested interests. The alignment of the faith group's core beliefs to the overarching principles of environmental sustainability is consequently still in its embryonic stages, despite some significant developments within the major Christian denominations. As a result, proposed sustainability initiatives have had a mixed result, with some very enthusiastic responses, while others are still operating within a limited paradigm of realities. These include worldviews, knowledge, values, attitudes, and available resources of time, finances, and human. So in conclusion then, the vision offered by Gardner in that faiths are inspiring progress is still a work in progress. And on that note, I'd like to thank you. And various centres that supported me, and if you need some references, there's some references there for you.
Thanks. That was great.
Thank you.
Andrew.
Oh.
Get a microphone on you. Self-sufficient.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Hi, I'm here. Yeah, I'd really like to say thank you to all the organizers and for everyone who came and traveled so far. It makes New Mexico feel kind of close. My name is Andrew Gingrich, and I recently graduated from the University of New Mexico in the Master's in Community Regional Planning. And I found out about this conference when I was in that awkward stage between graduation and looking for work, and I was sad that I would maybe never get to talk about sacred space and ecotopia again. And so I started to Google words like urbanism and ecology and spirituality and conference. And I never expected that I would end up in a place like this, and it's been great. And also, I forwarded that I had sent a proposal into this conference to someone on my committee for this master's thesis, and that person is Norman Crow, who many of you know, and he ends up being a member of this organization. He says hi. So I got into wanting to study planning after a bachelor, or studying history in undergrad. but also being persuaded by the ecological problems that we're experiencing in the world and wanting to get into a field that might be able to do something positive about it. And then as I got into studying planning, and urban history kind of caught my eye a little bit, having a history background. And I got interested in this idea of worldview and how worldview shapes the built environment, has shaped the built environment over time. And then, of course, wanting to combine that somehow with still our ecological problems. Or how does that help us engage, understanding that help us engage our ecological issues. And so for my master's thesis, I wanted to explore this idea of what some think of as an emerging worldview, ecocentrism, and the built environment. And since a lot of aspects of ecocentrism are kind of bringing back some ideas of a more traditional ancient worldview, that I was curious about the sacred also in this investigation. So I went to 3 communities and asked them about sacredness and their built environment and their values. So I just want to spend a little bit of time on the background, then I'll real fast track through all the methodology and stuff and the initial findings. I want to spend most of the time on some of the extrapolations from the findings that I think are maybe the most interesting for you all. So we're self-aware beings, and we have a sense of our separateness from the world, and so I think that this departure from nature might be something that's just part of being a human, recognizing how we're separate. And I was influenced by something I read for one of my courses by Joseph Reichert about how this might be something just inside of us. But he pointed out that this idea, and actually this is really wrapped up in the city, because the city is where our inner world meets nature. It's where our imagination starts to shape the natural world that we came from and that we live in. But Joseph Reichert says that there's, in a more primitive worldview, that there's a sense of tragedy out of this break and some sense of atonement for this break. And I have a lot of trepidation, I guess, speaking to you, because you all, I'm usually the oddball talking about this stuff, and you guys know so much more.
Oddballs.
Yeah, so it's a weird feeling. It's a good feeling. But the sense of when we depart from nature and building, that there's some kind of responsibility to make up for it somehow. And I was struck by that, because you're studying planning and all these, you're talking about economics and all these statistics and stuff, and I'm like, well, we're not atoning. We're not talking about atonement for the break of nature. I mean, that's the weird guy talking in class, and but nonetheless, I feel like this is kind of an important thing. And when we go to our current cities, and I don't feel like the separation from nature, this triumph over nature, is something that we celebrate almost, let alone something to atone for. And I don't know if you guys know what movie this is from, but it's from Koyaanisqatsi, if any of you have seen that movie, which is a shocking movie to me, but it's life out of balance and all the craziness that happens. So anyway, taking longer in this than I meant. In a lot of writers that kind of advocates for ecocentrism, and maybe I should step back and summarize that. Ecocentrism being that we should have a focus on how we as a human species fit into the whole panorama of life, instead of being the center of the universe. I think is probably a quick summary of that. They don't have very many nice things to say about the city. And with good reason, because it kind of insulates us from the natural world, and all of you know how we've made some pretty deplorable places. But when I took this broader view, or got a sense of this broader view what the city was or could be, I thought, hey, ecocentrists, this might be a really important thing to investigate, how the city actually helps us connect our internal world with this larger natural world that we find ourselves in. So that's the background, why I wanted to study all this stuff. So I wanted to get a little bit more specific about it. So I wanted to go to 3 communities, and I did a qualitative study with semi-structured interviews, probably more quasi-structured, barely structured interviews. 3 communities that all were, in one way or another, trying to build in harmony with the natural world. And explicitly, in their founding, they were doing that. One of them is Village Homes in Davis, California. It's like a subdivision. It's incorporated into the city limits. It was built in the early 80s, or started around then. Then I went to a kind of what you would imagine an off-the-grid kind of eco-village in Rome, Missouri called Dancing Rabbit. And then I went to Arco Santi near Cords Junction. And I actually was able to not meet Paolo Soleri personally, but to be a part of a question and answer session with him. And then he, as many of you know, he recently passed away. And I asked them about shared values. What's this place about? What does it mean? What's its significance? And then I asked them about the built environment and how does that reflect these values, or how does it facilitate living out these values? And then I asked them about sacredness, and I let them use that word however they wanted to. What does sacredness mean to you? And what is this place have anything to do with that sense of sacredness? And I think probably one of the most fruitful questions I had was, what are sacred feelings? And not to jump to the results, but that was very common. Even though people had different words for different ways that they define sacredness, sacred feelings were really common. Yeah, you guys know about arcology, probably. I can talk about that later if you want. So this is just a real quick slide about the methodology. I intentionally picked very different strategies. The Village Homes to Dancing Rabbit to Arco Santi are all very different, because the idea is that you could kind of generalize more if you had a more diverse sampling there of cases. And basic kind of grounded theory approach where I interviewed, transcribed, and then sifted and created the theory as a product rather than something you start with. And I used the software MaxQDA, which I think is more popular in Europe. I had a friend who worked for that company and told me about it. And then this is, just the diagram of the methodology, how I kind of synthesized each community, the results from each community, and then synthesized them together again. And then it's kind of hard to see on the screen. I apologize. And then I kind of came up with 2 extrapolations, which I'll get to. Excuse me. Yeah, the basic findings. So as I started to sift and categorize the interviews, things kind of started to fall into like 3 categories. Not really surprising categories, but there was a lot of emphasis on individuality and freedom of expression, people being able to be who they are, people having unique character traits. There was a lot of emphasis on living in community, and of course, and a lot of emphasis on value, and overwhelmingly, everyone had felt that nature had intrinsic value. And that's not surprising, really, but that, the trees aren't there to be wood for a house someday, that there's some intrinsic value to the trees being trees, and experiencing that. And the built environment seemed to have these same kind of categories. There's like the uniqueness of spaces, the uniqueness of structures seemed to be really critical to the way these places function. Lots and lots of common space, lots of places to gather in community, and then lots of incorporation of the natural world into these communities. And then sacredness, when I asked them about sacredness, they did fall into these categories also, where some people had a sense of sacredness where they were out alone in nature by themselves. Some people had a sense of sacredness when they were in community with each other. And some people had expressed a sense of sacredness when they felt their community was doing something together that was in harmony with nature. And so here's some unique structures. This is my attempt at diagramming these places. And you can see mostly single-family homes in Davis here, but there's a common house, there's a park and a vineyard, there's a little park there. The dancing rabbits more growing organically out of the prairie. I don't know how you diagram a three-dimensional city like Arcosanti, but that was my attempt. Everything's kind of stuck together. And then inclusion of nature. In village homes, it's so hard to take a picture of village homes because there's just stuff growing over everything. In Dancing Rabbit, there's a lot of earth building. In Arcosanti, of course, the idea is that you have a built environment, human world that's definitely separate from the natural world, but right up against it and influenced by it, participating with it that way. And I like, there's lots of quotes to go along with this, but that don't work very well in a presentation for time. But I like this one from Dancing Rabbit residents that said, in a sacred experience, the boundaries between I and it soften. So, extrapolations. So this is where I'm kind of taking the finding and I'm bringing it along a little bit more. I had two kinds of things I wanted to investigate. One was I wanted to figure out how are do these places become sacred? And I should have mentioned also that when I asked, is this place a sacred place? Every interviewee said that this isn't the only sacred place in their life, but this place enhances sacredness as they define sacredness after we had a conversation about sacredness. So these places are seen as sacred, however these people define it, to the residents. And kind of going through their stories and the interviews, there seemed to be some kind of a direction for how these kind of become sacred. And the first is that people have a longing for being more connected to the things that directly impact their lives. So where their food comes from, the process of building their own house, the systems of energy, having solar panels, being off the grid, and knowing their neighbors. Those are things that they felt in the conventional urban environment they didn't have the same ability to. Or it wasn't. They felt this disconnection to those things in their conventional urban environments. And then, so that's why they come to these ecotopias. They want to, did I even use that word yet, ecotopia? Sorry. That's what I'm calling these places that are trying to build in harmony with the environment. So,
Andrew, I'm going to tell you 5 minutes.
Okay, great. So then they get there, they kind of find these connections, and then it's through these connections over time that they start to grow their sense of who they are, and they have to build relationships in a variety of ways. And there are moments where they're more acutely aware that they're a part of something bigger, and it's community or it's the natural world. And this, even though there are these moments here that are like a little bit more momentary, that their effects are lasting, where they start to grow their sense of belonging. And that's kind of the title of this thesis, is Growing Home. They have a growing sense of being home. And then I tried to pull out some general design themes. I'll go through quickly. That kind of seemed to be important for this process. The first was that these places were all, you can sense this intentionality there, that the people that are there are responding to the specific context of the place. It's historic context, it's natural context, So the way people are using energy, they're growing food, all that. And that they're also not just doing it there, but they're doing that and they're opening it up to the world. So they're opening it up so it's the things that they're learning and highlighting by building there are made accessible to people. And the second is a sense of variety. Again, this kind of unique structures, unique spaces are really important. There's in all of three of these places, there is no spot that you're at that doesn't feel completely unique. And also these places are very well connected places with walking paths that are pervasive, very permeable, and they're all relatively dense. They're all not necessarily really dense, but close enough that they feel connected. Things aren't really very spread out. And these two here, I think, you have uniqueness and you have connectivity. You create a sense of mystery, but you also create a sense of openness to discovering. And that really creates a participation with the place. And that participation is what engenders this relationship and feeling of belonging. And that's how these places, again, become sacred. And then the last point is kind of a design theme, and that is that there's not any one space that creates a sacred experience all at once, that these are kind of, you have these solitary experiences, and 2 minutes. You have these these experiences with community. There's not one space or one experience. It's a multiple experiences that create this larger sense of groundedness and sacredness. So here's just some pictures. Intentionality, maybe, that here there's grapevines being used there's a south-facing window, and the grapevines shaded in the summer, and then the leaves fall off, and in the winter they get the solar gain. This attention to the mesa, where Arcosani is situated in Arizona on this mesa, and the sights from the mesa is just critical. Village homes, things, these little trails going through everything that open up into parks, compressed spaces and small spaces. Arcosani's got an amphitheater. You've got structures built out of all kinds of stuff at Dancing Rabbit. Yeah. Things are close together. This is village homes, and there's little walking paths. There's very few fences. The automobile is very limited. Arcosani's got weird nooks and crannies and buildings, and this is very typical village homes. And you get a sense here that's like, what's around that corner? What's there? What's that? And when I got there, I was immediately just drawn to explore the place.
21 words.
Okay, 21 words. Okay, I'm going to say that the basic takeaway from this is that, in 21 words, we need to see space as a medium for connectivity, the thing that binds life together. I'm not counting anymore.
That's it.
And that's the sacred power of space in the 21st century ecocentric context. And I don't know. Thank you. Thanks.
Well, you have about 10 minutes.
Oh, that's right.
Hold up. Hold on, Jack.
Enjoyed both these presentations as well as other ones throughout the day. Very stimulating. Now, Justin, you had a slide, your cathedral picture, that had health as one of the taglines, I think of it. And Andrew, this is the same question to you. Do people think or feel that these spaces are healthier in any substantive way or physiological way? And do they express it in that? Is it a healing space? Is it stress reducing and therefore enhancing of health? I'd like you to just share, both of you share some views on that.
Sure. I'll go first, sorry.
No.
I think that the health benefits is really only coming more to the fore in the recent years, certainly on the natural side of things. We have a researcher, Marty Townsend, who's been really promoting that in the last, say, 10, 15 years, that consciousness of a green space being also a healing space. And we're linking in with non-government organisations and government organisations dealing with depression. There's a Beyond Blue program that are trying to help promote people with various mental health issues to go into green spaces to get healing out of that. To get the links then to the spiritual community and that's the ongoing task. So that's sort of the green, the natural environment. As to whether the built ones, the constructed ones are in that headspace, I'm unsure on that.
What's your sense of course, it's self-selecting people that go to these places?
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
Actually, to further to that though, I know that actually here, I didn't realise there's a labyrinth. Now that also has been used as a mode for healing, and I think it's the Chartres Cathedral in Paris has the mandala, the labyrinth in it, so it can go way back to that era, and yet it's still coming through to this time now. So.
And yeah, you're right that these are self-selecting. The residents are choosing to go to these places, and I think especially Arcosanti and Dancy Rabbit that are that are further out in a more rural area and doing their own thing. There's the challenges of having a small community. I think both those places were about 50 residents when I was there. So there were challenges, but people expressed a sense of, I guess it depends on your definition of health, but a sense of more wholeness. And if that's a part of health, and I would think that it is, then these people feel more whole there.
Carol?
I just had a question for you, Justin. Besides the indigenous people whom you weren't able to interview, did you find in this kind of amazing opportunity to poll all these different religions, did you find that any of the others had sort of a driving reason, a philosophical reason to reconnect to nature? I mean, besides the moral imperative of...
Yeah, sure. It was very mixed. In another study I did, I managed to interview a Jewish Orthodox rabbi who was quite happy to go into a green direction, for want of a better phrase. But in Australia, we have certain political issues with the greening of spaces, whether it's culturally or environmentally. And so he was quite recalcitrant. He didn't really want to be involved because he then saw that he would be involved in other agendas that are linked in quite strongly with the green movement. And so his perspective was that he would want to be a part of that, only to purge the idolatrous nature, of nature worship. So it was very challenging for some that were still, I don't know if you'd say, stuck in their ways, in their orthodoxy. Whereas in other traditions, I suppose it's that amoeba of culture where you'll have some at a very tip that are wanting to move forward and be very progressive, and then the rest are still lagging behind. And that was really across the board. You had some that were quite progressive, but still, even within that progressiveness, they weren't too sure as to how far they wanted to go. Whether, say, for the Uniting Church, you saw the ones that did panels, and for them, maybe that's just it. That's all they're going to do is just put up panels and say, okay, that's our green tick. whereas for others they wanted to, okay, set up a community garden and then grow organic vegetables. This is one example I wanted to sort of talk about, didn't we, at the time, but it was more of a rural example that they reclaimed land next to their church, then put in a community garden which was organic stuff. They then made food from that. They had help from disadvantaged and disabled people to help with the making of the food, so they also had a community engagement program there. And then that food was given out to whoever, the homeless people. So it was a whole multi-layering of stuff that was more than just environmental. But that's just one little church, you know. So others were not quite in that headspace. So again, it was very mixed. Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Oh, I did, yes.
You did.
But I thought you had to see me.
I did see you, and this will be the last one.
I just wanted to say that I'm sorry that Harvey didn't stay for this panel, because these two presentations, I think, epitomize the kind of thing that Nader and Harvey were setting up at Harvard. It seems to me that your presentation, Justin, addressed how a countrywide or a statewide effort can address the global question, and that Alexander responded by illustrating clearly how small interventions cognizant of that global question can contribute constructively, and as they increased in parallel efforts rather than incremental efforts, in parallel efforts as they increase, the effect will be salutary. And thank you both.
Okay.